welcome you to our YouTube channel, Escaping the Revolving Door. I'm John LeMaster. You're viewing the third session now of a 12-session course entitled Escaping the Revolving Door Prison. Be sure to view the sessions 1 and number 2 before you view this session so you can get a better understanding of the full course content and then how this course of study came about in the first place. This series of classes has been developed to provide you men and women in prison now, or perhaps you've been released and maybe you're at home now, or you're transitioning back into society at a halfway house. We're going to provide you with the essential information that you need to be successful in your reentry efforts. The primary goal we had in developing this course of study was to help inmates, or former inmates, to never reoffend and be sent again to prison for committing another crime, because your life is far too valuable to spend years of it in prison behind bars or razor wire fences. Make sure you hit the subscribe button below, would you? And give us a thumbs up if you find this video helpful. Would you also be willing to give us some feedback in the comments section as to how we can improve your viewing experience on our channel? I want you to be aware that you can get a free handout of each of our classes on our website, lemasterministries.com, in the bookstore section. These are the very same handouts we give men and women who attend our in-prison courses. At the end of classes 2 through 11, I've assembled a page of questions you can answer to help you retain the points we present in our classes. Now, don't worry, I won't be asking you to send these in for us to grade them. These are basically just for your benefit only. In our last class, session 2, we looked at the number one reason the men at the correctional facility where my wife Kathleen and I were teaching a Bible study gave as the primary reason why men and women often reoffend after being released from prison. They found that when they were released, they had surrounded themselves with bad women and bad friends. As I mentioned in that class, I rephrased that statement this way. They had surrounded themselves with antisocial friends. We discovered in that session that the people we associate with have either a strongly positive or a negative influence on us. These people can shape our character through significant peer pressure. We discussed the role of discernment and what it plays in determining who our real friends are. I mentioned even that you could begin to take mental note of what your friends talk about. That'll give you evidence as to what kind of influence they're going to have on you. The ones that want you to be successful when you're released from prison, well, who are they? They're your true friends. We also found that we could limit the anti-social influence of friends by limiting our exposure to them and setting boundaries while maximizing our exposure to people who exhibit behavior intended to benefit us in some way. After identifying their number one reason for reoffending, the inmates said the next principal reason they had for offending or reoffending was when they were released from prison, they had a tendency to make poor decisions and choices. And they needed to be taught the guiding principles of how to go about making good decisions and good choices. In this session, we want to begin to develop an understanding of what these guiding principles for making wise decisions and choices are by first getting a thorough understanding of the power of choice and the awesome responsibility we all have in making good choices. Then we'll glean principles for making good choices by looking at the personal convictions that Moses and Daniel from the Bible had internalized that helped them make good choices, and the lack of personal convictions that caused a man by the name of Esau to make a very poor choice, one that he later regretted for the rest of his life. After that, we'll begin to get a good understanding of the importance of having personal convictions to guide us to make good choices. What personal convictions are, and then how do we go about developing them and incorporating them into our lives so that we'll be able to use them to help us make well thought out decisions and choices, ones that we don't come to regret later. Briefly speaking, personal convictions can be described as firmly fixed beliefs or opinions that resist compromise or us yielding to that pressure that others exert on us. Everyone has some level of personal convictions. There are some things that even the most hardened of offenders will not do. For instance, some may steal, but they won't steal from certain people. They may sell drugs to other people, but they're certainly not going to use them themselves. You can fill in the blank on personal convictions that you might have right now. The critical idea behind developing personal convictions is to upgrade them or enhance the level of personal convictions we have so that those result in us making better choices and decisions that don't result in regret. Now, I already know what you're thinking. I know the idea of convictions has a different meaning to those in prison. In our study here, we're not talking about conviction for committing a crime, but a personal code of ethics. And later on in this video, we'll go into a lot more detail on the subject of personal convictions and personal codes of ethics. I think we can all agree that there's an abundance of choices and decisions we all have to make in our lives almost daily. In fact, life seems at times to be all about making choices and decisions. Some choices and decisions are fairly simple. Well, let me see. Am I going to have bacon and eggs for breakfast, or a bagel, or a cereal for breakfast, or whatever is served in the prison cafeteria? Some decisions are relatively unimportant, while others are life-changing. Should I finish high school and then get my GED later? And then what about college or trade school? What vocation would be best suited for me? And then who should I marry? Yet all of our choices and decisions come with either rewards if they are good or consequences if they're bad choices or decisions. If you've been incarcerated for a long period of time, you'll even find it very difficult to make some very simple decisions and choices when you're released, because many of your decisions and choices have been made for you for so long that you have become what's been called institutionalized. That inability to make choices or decisions can be overcome once you are released from prison by just asking yourself simple questions to help you remember how you made them before you were sentenced to prison. Here's a funny illustration about choices. A group of college faculty was in their annual meeting when suddenly an angel appears. Turning to the dean, the angel said, "I will grant you one of three choices: infinite wisdom, infinite wealth, or infinite health." The dean thought for a minute, and then he replied, "I choose infinite wisdom." "So be it," said the angel, and the angel disappeared. The dean seemed to be deep in thought and was staring off into the distance when finally one of the other faculty members exclaimed, well, Dean, what do you have to say? What words of wisdom can you provide us?" And the dean cried out, "I'm messed up. I should have taken the money." You know, life has many choices. And it seems at times when we make one, we later have regrets about that decision we made and wish we could have made a different choice. When we make a decision to do something, we are exercising what's been called the power of choice. This freedom of choice, we call it, has been given to us by God Himself. Choice is a powerful word. In other words, we think it's powerful because of the rewards it allows us. But really what is so powerful is the fact that we can even make a choice at all. Any choice, either bad or good. You see, we're not marionette puppets on a string where someone else makes all the choices for us. In the Old Testament account in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, you'll remember when God created Adam and Eve, He made them free moral agents. He gave them the freedom to choose. God even gave all of us the freedom to accept or reject Him. In the Old Testament book of Joshua 24:15, Joshua makes this statement, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you'll serve. But for me and my household, we're going to serve the Lord." But with this freedom of choice comes an awesome responsibility that we all share. The words of Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt, as you remember, he was the 32nd president of the United States, ring true. She stated this: "One's philosophy is not best expressed in words. It's expressed in the choices one makes. In the long run, we shape our lives and we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die. The choices we make are ultimately our responsibility." How many of you, when you were younger, said, when I grow up, I want to become a drug addict or maybe a drug dealer or certainly an alcoholic, and I definitely want to spend a lot of my life in prison? Of course you didn't. But the choices and the decisions you made put you on that path, on that road that led you to that outcome. Someone has said we make choices, and our choices make us into who we are. We can ask others for guidance and help in making choices and decisions, but the responsibility for our actions falls squarely on our own shoulders. We can't blame someone else because we made that choice or decision all by ourselves. The power of choice is even seen all through the Bible. In the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 19 and 20, the Lord explains that He has set before us two choices. Hey, just two. Life, that's another word for blessings, and death, that's another word for curses. Then He even goes as far as to instruct us to choose life so that we and our children and our grandchildren might be blessed. Just so we don't misinterpret that statement, He even gives us the answer as to how to choose life. Don't you love it that God gives us the answer? The Lord goes on to explain that to choose life, we're to love God, listen, serve, and obey His commands. And then we're to hold fast to Him by spending time in reading the Word and staying close to Him through prayer. You might call studying God's Word and staying close to God through prayer keeping up with your spiritual maintenance. I like that analogy. It's just like cars that need physical maintenance to get the most life out of that old jalopy. So do we need spiritual maintenance to be able to make it through this life of ours victoriously and successfully. God desires to establish a personal relationship with us. And that relationship will bring blessings to our family and to us. Another example of choice in the Bible is given in the New Testament book of Galatians 6:7, where Paul the Apostle says, "Be not deceived, God's not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. That verse is telling us that our choices and decisions in life are like planting seeds. And we can be sure that there's going to be a harvest. Could it be that the things that you're going through right now are the harvest of the things you sowed earlier in your life? You know, it's something to think about, isn't it? We will not escape the consequences of bad choices and decisions. But we won't lose the reward of a good choice and a decision either. Let me give you an example of rewards of making a good choice in the financial world. If you made an investment of only $40 to purchase one single share of Coca-Cola stock when it first sold, and you held on to it, you would now own 9,216 shares after all the splits, and the investment would now be worth over $464,000 at the current stock price of $50.40 a share. Wow, that's a real example of a good decision. Let's take a more in-depth look at personal convictions by looking at the personal convictions that the Old Testament character Moses and Daniel internalized, and the lack of personal convictions Esau lacked to help us make better decisions and choices in our lives. Let's look at the story of Moses first, as recorded in Exodus chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. In order to stem the population explosion among Hebrew slaves in Egypt, the Pharaoh issued a decree that all male babies were to be drowned in the Nile River. Moses' parents protected their newborn son by hiding him for 3 months, but when they could no longer hide him, they made a waterproof basket covering it with tar, and placed him in it, and then put the basket in the Nile River just upstream near the place where the daughter of Pharaoh customarily bathed. Well, you know what happened. The princess found the child when she heard the baby crying and wanted to keep the child, but needed someone to care for the infant until it was a little older. His natural mother was chosen to raise her own son. After the child had grown older, the Bible says his mother returned him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she, the daughter of Pharaoh, named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. That's exactly what that word Moses means, drawn out of the water. Moses grew up as a prince in the house of Pharaoh. Let's look at what that meant to be a prince in the house of Pharaoh. Moses had the best of everything: the finest clothes, the best food, the best education. Since the Egyptian culture was very advanced in the principles of mathematics used in the building of the pyramids, he no doubt studied the early concepts of geometry and trigonometry, and also studied the advanced military tactics of the day. The Egyptians even used ropes tied or knotted at 3 foot, 4 foot, and 5 foot. That makes a base of a triangle that's 3 foot, the height 4 foot, and then the hypotenuse 5 foot, to form a right triangle for land surveying. And actually, that was an essential tool they used in building the pyramids. If you know anything about mathematics, geometry was developed by a man by the name of Euclid, who was an Egyptian. But Moses witnessed day after day how cruelly their Egyptian taskmasters treated the Hebrew slaves, and found out that he himself was a Hebrew. Influenced by what he saw, Moses had to make some critical decisions that would not only impact his life, but the lives of many millions of slaves living in Egypt. he basically had to make some life-changing choices by answering 3 questions. Number 1, am I just a child of Pharaoh? Number 2, do I embrace suffering along with my fellow Hebrews or enjoy the pleasures of being a prince of Egypt? And number 3, do I have a higher calling on my life from God? Perhaps you need to answer some life-changing questions too, like, what caused me to end up in prison? How can I avoid returning here? And is this my destiny to be a repeat offender and spend my life in prison? Or do I have a higher calling on my life too? It would have been a lot easier for Moses to continue living as a prince. Can't you hear his friends now saying, hey, man, Moses, don't rock the boat. Man, be cool. You got it made. Don't mess this thing up. But Moses would never have reached God's destiny for him and plan for his life to rescue his people from Egypt had he not made the right choices. Who would have led the Israelite nation across the desert to the promised land that the Hebrew people enjoy today? Who would have received the 10 Commandments up on Mount Sinai? Never forget this. You may not be a type of Moses, but you have a destiny too. One that will affect many others, including your family members, if you don't make the right choices. Psychologists tell us that people who can put off immediate gratification, that's pleasures and thrills and satisfaction and fulfillment of a desire, for a brighter future often make better decisions than those that will not put off those immediate needs of their lives. Poor choices that do not consider a greater plan for our lives will bypass God's plan for us. As you know, God has a plan for every life. If you only consider the short-term view, you'll miss out on an opportunity to develop a talent you have or prepare for a future position you may be interested in and may miss out on because you haven't prepared. It takes courage and determination to take a stand for what's right and pure. Moses did that. Moses honored God, and thus God honored Moses. Let's look at a summary here. In summary of our study of Moses, we can see that our choices, not chance, determines my and your destiny. Now let's look at a man, Daniel, and the dilemma he faced as recorded in the Old Testament book of Daniel, chapter 1. What do we know about Daniel? Well, Daniel was born into a wealthy family. He was part of the elite of his day. He worked hard and studied hard. He was in a high social standing. He was a relative of the king of Judah and Israel. He was raised with all the privileges and status of royalty, wealth, and power and education. Yet with his privileges, Daniel was not proud, or was he arrogant. He was a young man of character with moral qualities. He was not lazy or self-indulgent. He was absolutely committed to God and refused to compromise himself in any area. You see, Daniel was caught up in a world system and a culture that forgot God. God repeatedly sent prophets to warn the people of Israel, but they continued to rebel and live in doing wrong. And in 605 BC, God allowed the superpower of that day, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and his Babylonian armies to attack Jerusalem and take over the city. Nebuchadnezzar set up a puppet government, it's called, in Jerusalem, and took members of the royal family back to Babylon as captives. Daniel was one of the youngest hostages selected He was only about 14 years of age. Nebuchadnezzar's plan called for Daniel and his friends to be rigorously trained and indoctrinated. That's being brainwashed into accepting a set of beliefs not your own. For a period of 3 years, then at the age of 17 or 18, they would be allowed to enter the king's service. For a moment, put yourself in Daniel's sandals. He was taken from his family, would never see his homeland again. At the time, Daniel probably didn't see the hand of God at work as he traveled the 800 miles walking, riding a horse, or riding in a wagon. But God's ultimate plan was for Daniel to influence the highest leaders of power in the ancient world by advancing him to the highest position in the courts of Babylon and later in Persia. Daniel's a prime example of how to turn adversity into opportunity. I want to ask you a question. Will you turn your prison experience into an opportunity for achievement or total disappointment and loss? Daniel's rise in power, second only to the king, did not happen by chance, but it can be traced to two decisions, two firmly held personal convictions he had. His first personal conviction, Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Now, resolve is a very strong word. It means to be devoted to principle and to be committed to a course of action. Daniel chose his personal convictions, his firmly held moral beliefs, over food from the king's table because Jewish law prohibited Jews from eating certain foods, as you are aware. He would not compromise his integrity. That's the quality of being honest and having moral principles. A man by the name of C.S. Lewis said, integrity is doing the right thing even when there's no one watching. You know, we're living in a society that thinks compromising integrity, making concessions or giving in isn't really no big deal, John. Cheating and stealing have become commonplace. A letter was sent to the IRS. It stated, "Dear sir, last year when I filled out my income tax, I deliberately misrepresented my income, and now I just cannot sleep worrying about it. Enclosed is a check for $150 for delinquent taxes. If I still can't sleep, I'm going to gladly send you the rest I owe you." Wow. It's easy to compromise our virtue, our honor, our decency, our respectability when this type of behavior has become the accepted thing by society or the accepted behavior of even our friends. Remember the importance of discernment and determining who your good friends are from class 2? Daniel had the courage and personal convictions to be different. Notice Daniel had thought through his convictions before the temptation arrived, so that when it came to challenge him to compromise, he was fully prepared for it. He did what we should do, make up our minds to do the right thing and not compromise. Let's get a better understanding of what personal convictions are. Personal convictions are deeper than our beliefs or our feelings that, they tend to change over time. There's a vast difference between your beliefs or your feelings and your personal convictions. What you believe, you'll argue over. I've done it. Your personal convictions are something you are willing to die for. That's a quote by Howard G. Hendricks. Each of us must develop personal convictions by thinking through what is very important to me. What are personal convictions and why are they absolutely necessary in our lives? A good definition would be a firmly fixed moral belief or opinion that resists any compromise that I said earlier. To compromise means to yield to the pressure exerted on us by other people. They're strong beliefs that you're fully convinced of because you've been persuaded by clear evidence that something is true and right to do. What's the importance? Well, our personal convictions determine our conduct. They motivate us to take a stand, to act according to the values we have established. They just will not allow us to do certain things. The idea of a conviction is that you've made up your mind in advance before a temptation to compromise shows up to challenge you. Without convictions, we're subject to making poor choices because it's been found that our decisions and choices in life are not always logical, but they depend a lot on our feelings and our emotions. A part of developing personal convictions is developing a personal code of ethics. These are moral standards that we depend on and rely to keep us from violating principles that we hold dear when making decisions and choices. There's a term today called situation ethics that's being taught. It says there's no universal moral rules to govern our conduct. With this code of conduct, your emotions and your feelings determine what's right in a particular situation. And you and I both know that our feelings and emotions are poor determiners of correct action because they change so often. Let's look at the examples of codes of ethics. There's one code of ethics for lawyers. It's that they must provide competent representation for their clients. This means that they must be thoroughly prepared to represent their client in a court action, even though they may not feel well or have may even have more pressing responsibilities. A code of ethics for doctors is that they must place the interests of their patients above their own personal interests. I read recently a true story of a surgeon who was called to the emergency room of a hospital to operate on a young boy who had been injured in a serious accident. It took longer for the doctor to arrive than the father thought it should take, and so he began an irate verbal assault on the doctor. "Doctor, you don't even care about anything but your own convenience," he said. "My son is in critical condition, and you take your good old time getting here." After the successful operation, the man had more choice words of disdain for that poor doctor, and even told the nurse how selfish that doctor was. The nurse replied, "It took a while for him to get here, sir, because he had to leave during the funeral of his own son, who had died several days before in a serious accident." What had happened? The doctor had adhered to his code of ethics, even though he could have declined to come to the hospital for personal reasons. That code of ethics called on him to make a sacrifice. Examples of personal codes of ethics for individuals are that they will respect other people's property. They'll refrain from violence against another person and have respect for other people. Other examples are to obey the laws of the country and not drive recklessly or to avoid putting others in danger or many other such personal rules of conduct. This is referred to as obeying the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. Here's an example. The speed limit is 35 miles per hour in a residential area. But what if you're driving 35 and you see a child playing in the middle of the street? The letter of the law says, hey, you can go 35 miles an hour regardless. But the spirit of the law says caution is required for you to lower your speed or even to stop to allow that child to get out of the street. Let's look at Daniel's second personal conviction. He chose discipline instead of disorder. We know he was disciplined because the Bible says he prayed 3 times a day religiously. A study was done recently on those who went on into business and failed, and while others who were successful. The results showed that it wasn't the lack of ability that caused the failure, but a lack of discipline. Likewise, most of our failures can be traced to a lack of discipline in our lives, discipline in our speech, in our choices, in our devotional life. Now let's take a look at this man I said earlier about the story of Esau. The story of Esau and his brother Jacob is an example of a bad decision. These twin brothers were born to Rebekah and Isaac. Esau was the firstborn of the twins, so by custom, he was to receive what was referred to as the birthright. And one day after he was grown, Esau came in from hunting for game, and he sold his birthright to his brother Jacob for a bowl of red stew. Esau said, I'm starving. Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me? Well, let's look at what a birthright was. A birthright was a special honor given to the firstborn son. It included a double portion of the family's inheritance, along with that honor of one day becoming the family's leader. By trading his birthright, Esau showed complete disregard for the blessings that would have come his way had he kept that birthright. Esau had a lack of personal convictions. His primary conviction was what? To satisfy his physical need regardless of the cost. Esau made a terrible choice to sell his birthright because he chose to surrender to his appetite. For the rest of his life, Esau regretted his decision to sell his birthright. The Bible says in Hebrews 12:17, for you know how that afterward he would have inherited the blessing. He was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. You see, we can't undo the choices and decisions we make. So it's extremely important to make sure we're making the right choices and right decisions. But how do we do that? Well, I want us to look back into these 3 stories of Moses, Daniel, and Esau and see what these guiding principles are that we can find to help guide us when we're making important decisions and choices. What can we learn from Moses? Well, Moses chose to seek his destiny rather than enjoying the temporary pleasures of being a prince in Egypt. What can we learn from Daniel? Daniel's choices and decisions were based on his personal convictions rather than doing what was popular. Then what can we learn from this man Esau? When we make decisions, we need to consider the consequences rather than just react. We need to look ahead to see what will happen as a result of a choice or decision, and never make a decision or choice when you're discouraged, you're worn out, you're angry, or you're impulsive. If this class has been a benefit to you, please subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below. If you have any comments or suggestions, please list them in the comments section below or send them to our website contact page at lamasterministries.com. Be sure to tune into our next session of Escaping the Revolving Door of Prison, session number 4, entitled Making Better Choices by Avoiding Bad Choices, when we will develop more guiding principles for making good choices and decisions by asking ourselves 5 simple questions that I've come up with that will eliminate 75% or more of poor choices. Then looking at the 10 common mistakes that people make, and then 5 ways that businesses avoid making bad decisions. That'll help us make better choices. This is John LeMaster saying, I'll be looking for you in our next session.